Hi everyone, in today's video we're going to be going over how to do some Thor visual effects in Blender. I say this at the start of pretty much all my videos now, but if you want to get the project files from these videos, there's a link below to my Patreon, and for $1 a month you can get all of the Blender files from my videos, so you'd have to build anything from scratch and you can just get stuck straight in. But let's get on with the video! So the first thing I did is I went online and I found a few models of Mjolnir that I liked. There were some that had really good handles and then some that had better heads, so I ended up combining 2 or 3 models together, and then I used some 4K textures from textures.com to make it look really nice and realistic. I didn't have a physical Mjolnir prop, but I wanted something that I could hold and react to, and also that would be good reference for tracking. So I made an extremely high-tech reference model out of some old Domino's pizza boxes and a monopod, and then used some tape to put some tracking markers on it. Doesn't get much better than this. The first thing I do for all my VFX shots is I remove the lens distortion from all of the plates and then export it as a JPEG sequence to Blender. I used pretty much all types of tracking in this video. I did some hand tracking, some object tracking, and some camera tracking, as you're about to see. I started off by trying to object track the hammer in this shot, but it just turned out to be a bit of a faff and it wasn't really working, so I resorted to just hand tracking it and using keyframes to kind of match the position by eye. The glowing eye effect was just done in 2D. I did a 1-point track of my eyes in Nuke, and then drew a little rotor shape around my eyes, and then just added a glow, made it a bit blue, and bam! Do the same thing to the other eye, and now I'm the God of Thunder. The last and slightly tedious part of this shot is masking out the bit of the hammer that should be in my hand for every frame, but because it was moving so quick I just reveal painted the parts of the frame where my hand should be back over the top. For the closest shot of the hammer, I did an object track and it worked really well. I put in all of my camera information and focal length into Blender, and then started doing the tracking. This one would definitely need to be an object track because you need to see all the high frequency movement of my hand, and doing that by hand tracking it would be horrible. I didn't do any fancy tricks or anything for this object track. I just did enough points that I had some good reference, had to hand track them a little bit towards the end, but it was quite easy to do because the tracking points were nice and clear. And then I didn't even do any cleanup of the tracking points really. I just pressed solve and I had a decent solve error, so I just used that. So once the tracking is done, you add a camera, add the camera tracker constraint onto the camera, which will display the tracking points, and then I appended in the model of Mjolnir and added the object tracking constraint to Mjolnir, which means that it will start to move with the tracking points. And then the final touch on this shot was finding an HDRI that had similar lighting to the situation that I shot in, which made it look really nice embedded into the scene. The compositing for this shot was fairly straightforward. I just planar tracked my hand, and then I was able to draw a mask on one frame and use the planar track to move the mask. Once that was done, I offset the mask in my hand slightly and blurred it, and then I used that alpha to darken the handle of Mjolnir. Then all that was really left to do was fine-tune things like the exposure and the colours of the hammer. And then lastly, for the shot where the bowling pins come out of the floor, I did a camera track so I could match the camera movement in 3D. I've had a few questions recently on the Discord server about how I do my camera tracking, and I usually say that I track stuff in Nuke because I prefer Nuke's camera tracker, but I'm aware that lots of people don't have Nuke or don't know how to use it, so I thought I would track this in Blender so I could show you that it's pretty easy to do it in Blender as well. I made a nice basic model of the bowling pins. It's basically just a cylinder that gets a bit narrower and wider at certain points, nothing too crazy. I found a nice roughness texture of some fingerprints which I used and plugged that into the roughness of the principled shader, which added some nice surface imperfections so it wasn't just a perfectly clean bowling pin. And then I loop selected a couple of rings of faces and then just used the same material but made it red instead of white and assigned that to those 2 rings. I added a subtle displacement modifier onto the floor because as you can see it's quite uneven with all of the gravel and stones. This just helps to make the holdout look a little bit more realistic later on. Then I selected the faces I wanted to become the trapdoor and separated them, and then I selected the outside faces of the floor and just extruded them downwards to make the hole in the floor. I chucked a solidify modifier onto both of the trapdoor faces to give them some thickness because you'll be able to see the edges of them when they open up, and then just animated them to move down slightly and then retract into the floor. Then I set the outside faces of the floor to be a holdout so only the pit would show up, and I started adding some dirt textures onto the inside of the pit to make it look like it was going down into the floor. To make the tops of the trapdoors blend seamlessly with the texture of the floor, I did a project from view unwrap from the camera's perspective. Because the perspective changes throughout the shot, I used 2 different frames and then used a mix shader to switch between the 2 with keyframes once the trapdoors disappear under the floor. So when the trapdoors come back out at the end, it's using a frame from later on in the footage, which means that the perspective of the texture won't be too skewed. To make the dirt texture of the pit blend into the stony texture of the floor a little bit better, I hand painted a black and white mask. I can then use this to define the fall off between the projected texture of the stones and the procedural dirt shader. I used good old trusty F-Spy to line up the camera for the shot where the bowling pins get knocked over, and then I brought that into Blender and just modelled some simple geometry for the floor and the bush behind it. There's nothing too crazy about this shot, there's just a few different layers to it. I used the cell fracture add-on to fracture all of the pins so they would be in small pieces. Then I added rigid body constraints onto all of them, and then added a rigid body to Mjolnir, and then animated it to fly through the pins. And as you can see here, it knocks them all over and looks really cool. I went back and forth a bit with the velocity of the hammer to get the explosion looking right, and then once that was done I baked it, and then started doing a quick smoke sim as well. And then the final cherry on top was a small burst of sparks that come out as well. They're using the same emitter as the fire, and it's just a particle simulation with some initial velocity. It chucks them all out in a random direction, and they have a shader on them that makes them lose intensity over the course of about 50 frames. I set the scene geometry I modelled to be a shadow catcher, then used that to add the shadows in Nuke. On top of that go all the exploded chunks of the pins, and I did some colour correction just to make them bed in a little bit better. I rendered one frame where the pins weren't fractured without any of the cracks, and then switched between that 5 frames in just before they explode so they don't look fractured right from the beginning. On top of that goes Mjolnir, and I drop on some motion blur and stuff like I did in all the other shots. Then I dropped on the render of the sparks, added some motion blur, a little bit of glow, and made them blue to match the lightning colours. On top of that goes the sim of the explosion, again added some glow and things and some colour tweaks just to make it look a little bit cooler. I tried making all the fractured pieces of the pins a holdout in Blender so that they would cut through the explosion, but because there was no motion blur on the render, it wasn't really lining up with what I was doing in Nuke. So I did it the old fashioned way in 2D of using the depth pass in Nuke, crunched it down to isolate the foreground elements of the chunks, and then just cut that out of the explosion, which looks like this. And doing it this way I can just add the motion blur onto the depth pass as well, and then that means the motion blur will match between the holdout and the render of the chunks. And that's pretty much it. There's a few different techniques in there, so I hope this was a good insight into how I did all of the shots. If you enjoyed, consider subscribing. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.